Here's a request about a controversy that's been going on for a long time. This person says, what do you say about using white in watercolor? Some artists say it's a mortal sin. Some are using it to some extent. What is your attitude? Well, it's not a mortal sin, but I'll show you when it might be a little dangerous. Before I go into great detail of when you can use white with watercolor, let me show you what white actually does to your watercolor paint. And why people, maybe this might be the reason why some people are so getting kind of an uproar about using white. The watercolor paint by its nature is a transparent color, even though some of the watercolors are opaque. But the thing, as I explained to you in Quick Tip 299, with watercolor, the paper is actually the white. And so most watercolor painters depend upon the white of the paper to control the values, to control the lights within the paint itself. Sometimes there might be an area of white, I think I pointed this out too in 299, there might be an area that you want to avoid, but there are ways to do that. But before, I will explain most of that in 299, so let me show you the difference between what happens with water to create the light and what happens when you add white. So it's more visible, the change. White changes the characteristic of the color, so it's more visible in the darker color. So I'll just pull out ultramarine blue because that's one most people are familiar with. And I'm going to pull it out relatively dark on the palette first of all. Then I'm going to lighten it with water. Now this is the way we lighten watercolor. We just simply add water to it. And I'll just put a stroke or two over here so that you can see what it looks like when it's been lightened with water. Now, okay, a little bit of a tip here. If you're going to do with watercolor what I'm about to show you now, it's not a good idea to put white on your palette, because it does change the character of the color, and if any of that color, because of the way water moves around on the palette, if any of that white gets mixed in with your color, you're going to have a problem. So if you want to use white in the way I'm going to show you, use it on another palette. So I have another little palette that I'm going to sit right here, and I'm going to do all the work that I do with white in this palette. Now you could use a dinner plate for this. You don't have to go out and buy a fancy palette or a fancy pan. So you could just use a dinner plate or anything plastic. It doesn't really matter. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring that dark, I'm going to go right in here. I'm going to bring that dark ultramarine blue onto this palette. But this time, rather than using the water, I'm going to use white. Now I want you to see, I'm going to try to aim for pretty much the same value as I have with the version of water to create the light. I'm going to put this right beside it and see if you can see then the difference in the character of the color. I need to have it just a little bit lighter, so I'll put a little bit more white into it. It begins to be more opaque. There we go. That's closer to the value. Just pull that right over here. And now you can see there's been a decided change in the characteristic of the color. Now, if I add more water to that, I just did something I shouldn't have done. I used my water for my watercolor. I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, if I thin that with water, it retains that characteristic. You can see it right here. I'm going to put these just side by side. You can see that this has a slightly, well, it may be cooler, but it's a more opaque light than this is. Then with ultramarine blue, depending upon the paper you use, you'll notice that as it dries, you begin to get this granulation within the texture of the paper. And then as it dries with white, you'll see a different characteristic. And of course, with watercolor, when it dries, you don't have what you have while it was wet. So that's another consideration. The other thing I want to point out is it's really a better idea to rinse your brush in a different water container when you're working with white than it is to use the same water container as when you're working transparently. And that's simply because if any residue of the white gets left in the brush, it will transfer over. Now I want to show you another color that the difference is a little bit more marked, and that is green. So I'm going to go into sap green here, and I'll just pull a little bit of that sap green, and I want to show you, I'll put this right here, I'm going to show you sap green using water to make it lighter. Well, this one, use a little bit more water, make it even an area a little bit lighter right here. Now, alright, let me show you what happens to sap green when you mix it with white to make it lighter. So I'll pull some sap green right over here, and I'll just go on this side of the white, and I will create a value of sap green with the white. Now watch what happens. You can see a change, really a change in the characteristics of the color that's much more visible. There we go. That's more like it had a little bit being influenced a little bit too much with the water there. There we go. You can see that the white in the sap green makes it a cooler color. White, when mixed with color, when we're working with oil or acrylic or even gouache, when we mix white with color, it actually cools the color. And so, but when we're working with watercolor, adding the water to the color doesn't cool it. It just changes the value. And you can see now a better comparison, now that this is beginning to dry, you can see a better comparison of the characteristic with white here against the white there. Alright, now that I've shown you that, I want to show you what you can do with that with watercolor. Now I know about those arguments, I know about those controversies, but there are some things that you can do with white to use it effectively when you're doing watercolor. Anytime you would like to communicate in the painting itself something that feels opaque and still very, very light, white is a good way to go. Now, fog is a perfect example of that. So I'm going to do just a little bit of a demonstration right here to show you how you can use white in the watercolor to create the effect of fog and still use the transparency of watercolor to contrast images that you would see in front of fog. So to do that, I want to begin by making a drawing, just a very simple. Let's just make a little bit of a window here. Now I have here a photograph, and you can see we've got fog, a real thick fog here. And you can see the trees that are closer to us are more visible. We can see that they really don't feel so much in fog, but the trees behind us here do feel in fog. Now you can notice in this photograph that these trees seem more opaque right in here. All those that are in fog seem more opaque. They feel a little cooler. There's less contrast in them, and the more the fog obscures them, the more opaque they get, whereas these in front feel more transparent. So what you might try, if you want to just do an experiment with this, what you might try then is to create maybe a little drawing, something like this. And I'm just not going to try to do the whole thing. You know, on these quick tips I never do. I just show you enough, and maybe I can just stop right there. I can show you enough so that you can use the concept. Now, first of all, what I want to do here is just give the whole area a very slight wash of water. Have it damp so that everything will flow. So just give this a very slight wash of water. And we'll begin to see the characteristic of what white does. Alright, now that is the whole color there is more blue-green. And so what I'm going to do now that I have both these colors, and you see there was a little method in my madness there, Going back to the watercolor tray here, I'm going to then pull blue. I've got to have that less wet, so I'll go to blot the brush. Kind of blue and green. I want to get something of what I'm seeing up here. Now I'm going to pull the white into that. Alright. Pen's being a little bit unruly here. Pull enough white in there, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just sort of, let's get more white and more green. Okay. Just lay that light, opaque wash with white in it, in those areas only where I see fog. Now I know in the photograph it shows us a little bit more yellow, but I'm just going to keep this in the blue-green range. I'll get it a little bit cooler by adding a little bit more blue. You know, you get variation, and it does help the feeling of things. Now here I'm going to bring it down just in between those trees. I'm not touching the area where the trees live. So just pull that opaque color into those areas. Now if I wanted to come on down a little bit, I could pull it down like that. Now I'm going to move the tray out of the way here, and I'm going to go to the transparent colors. And I'll switch brushes here because I need a smaller brush to do that. Now I'm going to, on my non-opaque palette here, I'm going to use a different green from that. On my non-opaque palette, on my regular palette, I'm going to pull out some rich sap green and ultramarine blue. I'm looking at this, and also this is drying a little bit. It will still be damp. It's drying a little bit so that I can manage this. Now, I'll pull those two together, and that's going to give me kind of a blue-green that I'm seeing, but I also want to add to that what we're seeing as it goes darker down here by adding a little bit of the yellow-green complement, which is red-violet, more red-violet. So I'll just pull into this violet right here. Let's make a little bit of that. That's the violet that leans towards red, but in a dark range. Now that will give me that ability to get it dark as I go down. Just a little bit here. Now I'll start out by adding the water, just the water for the color, to lighten the color as I see it. Well, let's see if we're right up in here. Get it a little bit lighter just with the water, and take the tip of my brush, very light, and drop it in to these opaque areas. Now this is still wet enough, and you can see what happens when I do that. It begins to disperse, begins kind of disperse in the white. It's going to give us that sense, get that just a little bit cooler, keeping it very light. It's going to give us that sense of trees in the fog, of those trees in the fog. So I'll just pull it on down here. Get just a tiny bit darker as it comes down, and kind of let it, those are the trees behind, and just let it kind of peter down like that, a little bit up in here. Now we'll do just a little bit more. Now you see those, as trees go way in the distance, they practically totally disappear. So just get a little bit, very light. Here I'm using water as the lightener. And we get a little bit of that. Let's get that a little bit even lighter. A little bit of those that are further back, and a little bit of white space in between. Get them a little bit darker as it comes down. The ones in front a little bit darker there. The white, you can see how now you can see how the white in there sort of disperses that image and makes it feel more out of focus as it does in fog. All right, now the stuff that we see back in the distance there, we would take care of that in the first wash that I just did there. Now we're going to see the contrast between what the paper that does not have the white on it can show against the paper that does, or the areas that do have the white. So now I'm going to move in, and we're going to look at these trees in front. So I'll just, not very much water on the brush because I'm going for dark this time. So when we're going for dark, we don't have much water on the brush. This is a good idea not to. Now let's just see. So if I can go up in here where I did. Now I can touch those areas of white just a little bit, and that will cause that to get a little bit, because it's beginning to dry now, so we'll have that still with it beginning to dry. We'll have where the white touches, it's going to kind of spread out. You see, like right there where the white exists there, if you paint on top of it with a darker color, because that opaque color is sitting there, it's going to blur out. And that's okay when you're doing a fog scene, because the tops of those trees might be in fog. So I'm just going to bring that on down. And now we're going over here in front of the opaque. You can see that same thing happen again. Then we're going to begin to move into areas where there is no white. Now, but do I need that? That may need to be a little bit more dampened, but let's just see. Yes, it does need to be a little bit more dampened. And the color, I wanted the technique to be the thing that I'm teaching here, but I am moving into these colors, the sap green, elk green blue, and then pulling a little bit of that violet in there to get that cooler and more of an in-shadow feeling, because there is no sunlight hitting those trees. All right, so we come on down like this. Now you can begin to see the difference between the transparent area, and you're really going to see it at the bottom, the difference between what happens in the transparent area right in there. See how much clearer that is where there is no white. Now I'm going to overlap the white on purpose right here, just so you can see the paint begins to kind of move out into that white and go into sort of a blur. And that, for that reason, using white to create fog is almost a perfect technique for really when you really want to translate or translate, I guess is a good term. When you really want to communicate fog in trees. And then you can tell now that if I brought this on down all the way to the bottom with the tree trunks, etc., blah, 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 where there is no white, I don't have any color down here either, but you see where there is no white, the paint pretty much, when I don't have the paper damp underneath it, the paint pretty much stays where I put it, but where I go into white, you can see it begins to kind of bleed out. So that is a good way to use white, and it's okay. So anytime any of the people who are so dogmatic about not using white with watercolor try to argue with you that white does not belong in watercolor, perhaps you can give them a little demonstration on doing fog. Be sure to view all of our quick tips, and while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.